So I just wanted to introduce you guys to Lou Pastina. Lou Pastina graduated with a degree in accounting from St. Francis College in 1976. 79, I'm sorry.
I look old.
He began his career in Seiko Time Corp, and then he would move on to CIT Financial. Followed by his time at CIT Financial came along in prosperous career at the New York Stock Exchange, where he recently retired from. After his retirement, he has gone on to advisory, and he's at Global Markets Advisory Group. I would also like you guys to give him a round of applause for being one of those speakers that at every single moment that he has been reached out to, he has, come forth for St. Francis, and we're always very thankful for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much, Miguel. Anytime St. Francis asks for something, I try to be there. I got so much out of being here that it means a lot to me to come back and to just share my time with St. Francis. I was lucky enough when I graduated from St. Francis, I went and interviewed with someone for an internship at Seiko Time. It turned into a job that lasted for 4 summers and winters when I wasn't working. And then when I went for a full-time job at CIT Financial, I was lucky because there was a St. Francis College grad on the other side of the table interviewing me, and those St. Francis College connections meant a lot in my life. So thank you for having me.
So I just wanted to start and ask you, Lou, could you share a little bit about the process of a company going public, or what we know as IPOs, initial public offerings?
Sure. So when you first asked about if I would speak about that topic, I thought it would be a good idea first to take a couple of steps back and see where it all starts. And so well before a company goes public or their initial public offering, it starts with someone who has an idea, a vision, an entrepreneur. And so it's great to have New Utrecht here and the Entrepreneurship Club here and the Accounting Society here, because you may come up with an idea that will eventually land you ringing the bell at 9:30 in the morning at a public exchange for a public offering. And entrepreneurs, they start off with ideas, sometimes, though, not with much else. And so entrepreneurs need things to get their businesses started. They typically have this great thought. They may have a great product or service, but there's one thing that they need that they don't have, which is capital. So if you have the idea, in order to execute on the idea, you need access to funds. And entrepreneurs typically get funds from angel investors like mom and dad. They'll ask mom and dad for money, or relatives for money, people that they know. But if they can't, or if they run out of mom and dad's money, they might go to a bank and ask for a loan. But it's hard to get a loan when the only collateral that you have is an idea or a concept. And especially in today's market where banks are not lending money as much as they did prior. If you're able to develop your idea into a mature company, you might be able to attract the interest of private equity funds or venture capitalists. And those are firms, individuals who make it their living to invest in the ideas of others to help them grow their businesses. But typically when they make that investment, they ask for something in return. They may ask for interest on a loan, but they may also ask for a piece of the company. So an equity stake in the company, and you may not own 100% of the company anymore. So those are some of the things that you have to think about. And if you're able to grow your company to a point where you need a lot of money, maybe you need to build a manufacturing plant, or you need to invest in new computers, then really the only place to kind of get that money is in the public markets. And by public markets, I mean you actually sell stock in your company, and in return you get cash to invest in your business. When you do that, the investors are looking basically for 2 things. They're looking for income, so maybe dividends or interest, and they're looking for capital appreciation on the investment that they made. In other words, they want you to grow your business. And when you make that decision and you've gone public, you typically have given up a little bit of control over your company and perhaps your life as well, because if you've invested your life in your company, in order to get the funds that you need to grow the company, you've had to sell stock, which means that other people now own a piece of your company. So that's just a little, piece of the background of what happens in terms of funding an idea, but it all starts with the entrepreneur. Now, I will say one thing, Miguel, which is if you look back over the last 10, 15 years, there's a troubling aspect of what's happening in the U.S. and perhaps globally, and that's this. There are less public companies than there have ever been before. So if you were to go back 10 or 15 years ago, I think I have it written here somewhere, 1997, almost 20 years ago, there were 8,884 public companies. So a public company is someone who lists their stock at the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, and you can buy or sell those shares, right? And you have access to their success, and you can grow along with them. So almost 9,000 companies back in 1997. As of 2012, there were less than 5,000 companies, almost a 45% decrease in the number of public companies available for all of us to invest in. And you may say, well, what does that matter? Well, I think it does matter because there are a couple aspects to that are troubling. One is that we can't invest in the companies that are growing, and therefore we can't increase our wealth with their wealth. Another thing is that you have to ask the question, well, why aren't they going public? Is it that mom and dad had so much money that they don't need to go public anymore? I don't think so. Is it regulation? There's been a lot of regulatory regimes that have been put in place over that time period. Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, the SEC written numerous new rules that you have to abide by. FINRA has as well. So if you step afoul of those rules, and you can see what happened to the CEO of Wells Fargo this week, he's stepping down now. You lose your job, or perhaps be fined, or maybe even go to jail. And so people don't want to be subjected to those rules and regulations. If you stay private, you don't have to do certain things. And the other reason why there are less companies is that companies buy companies, and they decrease the total. So when Exxon bought Mobil years ago, there were two companies at one point, Exxon and Mobil. When Exxon bought Mobil, there was only one, Exxon Mobil. So there's a 50% decrease right there. Other companies decide to go private. They were public, but they don't want to be public anymore. They buy back all their stock. So the whole notion of going public is a big question, and it's a terrific problem to have because it means that your business is growing so fast that you need access to funds. But you have to consider the pros and cons of going public these days, and clearly many companies have decided that they don't want to go public in an IPO.
Now, Lou, you mentioned regulators and regulatory changes in the environment. So what are some of the things that the New York Stock Exchange and other exchanges look at when they're looking at the IPO process? What are some of the key factors that you say, okay, well, is this company good enough at the moment to financially sustain an IPO once they actually go public?
So the New York Stock Exchange has a longer track record than the NASDAQ does. NASDAQ was created in the mid-'70s as a quote system. It grew into an automated system and a system where small companies could list their stock. And typically, those small companies included giants that we know today, like Intel and Microsoft and Oracle, but it was a place for small tech companies to trade and to grow. The New York Stock Exchange was the home to all of the blue chip companies, GE, IBM, companies that had been around for a long time. And the New York Stock Exchange had very stringent listing standards. So you had to be profitable, You had to demonstrate a long history of profitability, and the listing standards for the New York Stock Exchange were like the seal of good housekeeping. If you were listed there, it meant that you had good corporate governance. The people that ran the company were all above board, and financially they were very sound companies. If you went bankrupt, they might put a Q at the end of your symbol to say that you're going into bankruptcy. And if you actually did go through bankruptcy, they would delist you and actually throw you off the exchange. NASDAQ had looser listing standards in the very beginning of its tenure. And over time, through the 80s and 90s, became more competitive with the stock exchange. And they decided the best way to compete was to not loosen their standards, but actually to tighten them. So NASDAQ became to look more like the New York Stock Exchange in terms of listing standards. As the two of them competed, and it's really a duopoly, right? So it's only two competitors in this market for listing stock in a public market. There are two others who'd like to be in that game right now, BATS and IEX, but they're not in the game yet. And if you are not big enough for either of those exchanges, you could list on the pink sheets or the OTC market, which has very less stringent standards. But NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange started to diversify their listing standards. So let's say you made money 3 out of the last 5 years. Well, since NASDAQ was allowing a company like that to list, the New York Stock Exchange said, okay, well, we'll allow a company like that to list as well. So they loosened their standards a little bit there as NASDAQ strengthened theirs. But then during the dot-com years, late 1990s, early 2000s, as a lot of companies, internet companies came about, there were companies that were started by entrepreneurs, people who had a great idea, computer in the basement, but they had no revenues. So they had no track record, but their private equity investors, their venture capitalists, had invested enough money in them that they had a market valuation of somewhere of $1 billion or more. And the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ said, well, if you can't demonstrate that that you have net income or that you have sustainable revenues, but you have this great business model and you're valued at such a great amount, we'll look at market capitalization. So the two exchanges basically look at those three main criteria for determining whether you can be listed on their exchange. They look at revenues, net income, or market capitalization.
Now, we're assuming that they're already listed. What are some of the things that you look at when you have to figure out, is a company in the position that they might be delisted?
Well, when a company decides that they're going to go public, they have to do a few things. And this is good news for the accountants in the room because they have to hire accountants. They have to hire auditors. They need audited financial statements. They have to fill out a form with the Securities and Exchange Commission called an S-1. And the S-1 is a document that's about this thick. And guess what? Who fills it out? Accountants, auditors, tax accountants, lawyers, advisors. Those are people who get involved in helping a company fill out a document like that. So they fill out this form, the S-1. They file it with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then the bankers, they have to choose a banker as well. The banker helps them choose what exchange to list on. And when they make that decision, they then have to fill out an application with that exchange. When the exchange gets the application, it goes to a committee. So I spent about 10 years on the New York Stock Exchange's committee reviewing applications that were coming in to list on the stock exchange. And that committee was made up mostly of people within the exchange, was made up of the CFO, corporate secretary, the head general counsel, myself as the head of operations, and a few other people who were involved in the listing process. And for the listing department, they always wanted us to say yes, but one of the things that we had to do was look beyond just the numbers to see if there were other reasons why a company should not be listed. So one of the reasons why you wouldn't list a company, even if they had great numbers, was reputational damage. So one year, Playboy wanted the list, and we had a general counsel who was staunchly against it. He thought it would be terrible for the stock exchange to be listing Playboy, and I think we at the time we decided not to list them because there would be reputational damage for the exchange. So there's a whole process that you go through. That same committee then looks at companies that might fall outside of their original requirements and decide whether they can continue to be listed. And if they don't meet the requirements or they can't subscribe to a plan to get themselves back on track, they will be delisted.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working at the New York Stock Exchange during the crisis, during 2008, 2007?
Yeah, the scars have healed, so I can now talk about that. But I became the head of operations in 2007. And prior to that, I was involved on the development side, the systems development side of the New York Stock Exchange. I helped the stock exchange become an electronic market. It's known as a hybrid market. They still have people on the trading floor who trade, but they use systems to help them process the vast number of orders that they get every day. In 2000, I think the number of orders that the exchange received was about 1 million a day. By 2007, it was over 100 million orders a day. There were only maybe 2,000, 2,500 people on the stock exchange floor. They all had computers. They had keyboards that we had developed. And back in those days, they didn't hit the keyboard that much because there weren't that many orders that came in. But by 2007, they were hitting the keyboard over 50 million times a day. On average, about 2 to 3 times per second all day long for 6.5 hours. So we had to automate that business. When I took over in 2007, the very day that I took over as the head of operations, all the systems stopped working. So they came to a crashing halt, and the new CEO, John Thane, at the time said, "What do we do now?" And I said, "I have no idea what we do now. It's my first day on the job." So he didn't think it was that funny, but I thought it was pretty funny. But he didn't fire me. He said, well, fix it. Let's get it back up and running, and we did. 2008 rolls around, and all of a sudden, people like Lehman and Bear Stearns and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have huge financial issues, and they start to crater in, and the market starts to dive. And those were hairy days on the floor of the stock exchange. At that time, the stock exchange still did about 85% of all of the listed business in the U.S. So it was very nerve-wracking. The systems that we had built were, we had upgraded all the software, but we had not upgraded the hardware. So the hardware was under constant strain and constant threat of failing. And every day that we came in, we didn't know if we would make it through the end of the day. So we finally got that all fixed by 2009. We drifted into 2010, and all the markets being automated as they were in 2010, and without a lot of people having too much experience, the market crashed over 1,000 points in a matter of seconds, and then in a matter of seconds rebounded back up, and everybody looked at each other as to what just happened. No one had a clue. But it was clear that we were in new territory with electronic trading and that a lot of work needed to be done. So those were very hairy days back then. The markets are a lot more stable today, even though, as Dr. Anderson pointed out to me today, they're crashing. They're down 100 points, 150 points. That's not a crash, but it's a lot more stable today than it's ever been before.
Do you have any funny anecdote or any juicy info that you could give us about your time at the New York Stock Exchange?
Well, there are a lot of them. The one that I really liked the best was there was a trader on the floor whose father had built this trading business, and they were specialists, which meant that they were the ones involved in managing all the buy and sell orders. And the specialists were given a franchise basically in each security that they traded in. And one of the securities that they had was Coca-Cola. And the father had said to the son, who was drinking a Coke, he said to him, and he was also trading Coke. He said, lose the Coke. Now, the son had built up a huge position in Coca-Cola, and what he thought his father told him to do was to sell every share that he had of Coca-Cola, when all he was telling him was, just get the Coke off the counter. I don't want it spilling on the machines. But at the end of the day, when he came down, I said, how are we doing? He said, well, I did what you said, Dad. I sold every share. He said, no! You'd have a lot of things like that. There were people, the floor of the stock exchange somehow was a magnet for every kind of crazy person that was in the tri-state area. And so if you were really a hyper individual, it was a great place for you to be. But it was filled with like 5,000 of these people under one roof. And some of them were dyslexic, right? So, and a large part of the population were male, which means they were colorblind, so they couldn't tell the difference between green and red. And of course, in the markets, green means things are going up and red means they're going down. And they would get that confused all the time. Or they would go out and a trader would tell them to sell stock. They'd go out and buy it. He'd come back and said, I bought it. He said, I told you to sell it. He'd go out and he'd buy it again. And they'd do this over and over. And of course, they'd come to the operations staff and say, can you help us? We just look at them. Maybe we should send you to medical and not to anywhere else. But it was an amazing place. There are still about 1,000 people on the floor of the stock exchange. It is the only equity exchange in the U.S. that has people working in the process. It's if I might invoke Sully, the airplane pilot, the exchange is people who work there. They're like airplane pilots. They open up the trading. They exercise human judgment. They take controls for the opening and they take controls for the close. But mostly during the trading day, the plane flies on autopilot, and so the machines take over. And so if there are people here who are in the computer department and taking programming, know that there are always going to be jobs for you in this industry as well. But there's still about 1,000 people down on the trading floor. Not as many crazy people though.
Now, some people nowadays complain or maybe make comments about the fact that regulation is growing and it's growing very fast. What's your take on that? Do you believe that it's growing rapidly, or do you see regulation just moving as it should be moving?
I forget how many rules the Dodd-Frank package actually prescribed for the SEC to write. But at the last time I looked, the SEC, and it's almost 5 years later, the SEC is only about halfway through to not even 3/4 of the way through the number of rules that they have to write for everyone to follow. And it's the securities business, people who are brokers, retail brokers, used to be a fun business. It used to be about helping people, but you could also have some fun in the business. It's not as much fun anymore, I can tell you that. There's not many people in that business who consider it to be fun business. And it's mostly because of the regulation upon regulation that they have to follow. A lot of them are very good. A lot of them are kind of common sense. You might think that they're common law based, so there's not an actual need for a regulation that says that you have to do what's obvious. But they keep piling them on. I think that we've gotten to a point where it's really a deterrent to people who want to enter businesses. The banks are a great example of this. I'm reading today in the Journal that the banks have had to create separate entities within their organizations in case the rest of the bank goes bankrupt, and that the separate entity can continue to make sure that the ATMs are still working, for instance. So if you remember a couple of years ago when Greece had their banking problems, none of the ATMs worked. So could you imagine if you needed money, you go to the ATM, there's no ATM where you get your money? Not a good thing. But so those are the kind of things that are good, but in general I think it's pretty difficult.
Okay. So we're moving into a more global economy and a more globalized companies and so on, and we're seeing more investment abroad, and we're seeing more companies sometimes leave the US and establish tax addresses in other countries. So
Apple, right?
Apple. How does that, how does the New York Stock Exchange look at that and, kind of judge how that would affect the company's future positions economically?
Well, The exchange, that would fall into the reputational area. So the numbers themselves are not going to shout out to say, well, Apple should be here in the U.S. paying taxes rather than sheltering their income in Ireland. So the exchange really, I don't think, would take a position on that in general, but they might consider the political atmosphere and whether a company that did that exclusively might come under fire and whether there would be reputational damage for listing a company like that.
Now, is there any other funny anecdote you have for us?
Now I'm all out of funny anecdotes, but I do have a couple of questions. So there are a couple of things that I saw in the paper today, which I wanted to just talk about. One is about Brooklyn Brewery. So we had Brooklyn Brewery here, I guess last year. Steve Hindy gave a terrific speech, and he started this business in Williamsburg, and with some investors. And Steve, the co-founder of Brooklyn Brewery, is since retired as CEO. I think he's executive chairman now. But they just announced that they were selling about a quarter of their company to Kirin Beers, a Japanese brewer. And I found that interesting because he was very strident in his belief about craft beer. And so I was amazed that they actually sold out. Now, granted, he didn't sell it to Miller or to Budweiser or InBev or SAP, some of the bigger companies. And I was struck by the reason why they said they were going to sell. And it ties into the conversation we were having a little bit earlier about entrepreneurs. And Steve started this business with nothing really on the south side of Brooklyn and Williamsburg. So they talked about Brooklyn Brewery gearing up for expansion. They just signed a 40-year lease for 75,000 square feet at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, who's a great friend of the college, where it plans to set up its offices, a beer garden, and brewery operations. And so the now CEO, Eric Ottaway, said, "This helps us execute on our strategies. We did not want to have to take on crushing amounts of debt or go to private equity and face pressure to flip the company. This gives us long-term patient capital." So they're not a public company, right? So their options for actually raising cash are limited, right? And so he says, we didn't have to go to private equity. Because private equity, if they were to invest in the company, what they would want to do is they would come in, they fire a bunch of people, they dress the company up, and then they look to sell it to make money on their investment. He said, we don't want to do that. The other thing they didn't want to do was to borrow money from banks and others and incur crushing debt, right? So that would cut into their income stream and make them less viable as a company. So what they did is they found a strategic partner, and it's very difficult to crack the beer market in Japan. And they did their homework. They realized that this was a good way for them to enter the market and sell their craft beer into that market with a partner. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting is there was another article in the journal today, Tech Boom Creates Too Few Jobs. And it talks about some of the huge tech companies that have come into being in the last 15 years, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others. And they have a graphic, and the caption in the graphic is that few technology companies are doing initial public offerings. It's exactly what we've just been talking about, right? Which can help spawn more jobs as those companies grow. And it says companies that went public in the 5 years before the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 had more employees overall than those with IPOs since then. So, again, companies are choosing not to go public. So I have a couple questions. One is, anybody ever hear of J. Crew? J. Crew, New Balance, Forever 21. Come on, ladies. Okay. Levi's, Bloomberg, Fidelity. Public or not public? None of them are public companies. Not one of them. How about if you're a public company, you have to file reports with the SEC. You have to file a 10K and a 10Q. 10K is a yearly financial report, and a 10Q is a quarterly financial report. So guess who fills those out? Accountants. So good news for the accounting guys again. But And guess what? They can't make a robot to do that. So that's good news for you as well. So, but if you have to fill these reports out, who reads them? Financial analysts. And guess who financial analysts are? They're management and accounting majors, right? So good news again. So financial analysts look at these reports and then they make recommendations. Should we buy this stock? To their client, should you sell the stock? And if you have to do that every quarter, let's say, one quarter, I don't know, a couple of customers, big customers of yours are having their own financial difficulty and they pull back and your numbers don't look good this quarter. All of a sudden, now the financial analysts start to say, oh, we see a trend here, this stock may not be doing well, and people sell it. Now, if you are lucky enough to come up with a great idea and you IPO'd your stock and let's say your GoPro or your Twitter, and your life is tied up in this company, and you have a bad quarter, and your net worth is tied up in this company, and the financial analyst reads this quarterly report and says, I would dump this stock, it's not going anywhere. What did they just do to your net wealth, your life, your livelihood, your idea, the thing that you created? They sunk it, right? So that's why a lot of people decide not to go public anymore, and that's a big reason why these companies are not public. But then again, if you look at companies who have gone public in the U.S., Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, ExxonMobil, Facebook, Johnson & Johnson, General Electric, Wells Fargo, these are huge companies. They need access to capital. And guess what? They hire a lot of people. And a lot of those people are accountants, financial analysts, lawyers, advisors, and they do those reports for them, the S1s and the 10Ks and the 10Qs.
So where would you go for like an investor at a young age?
Where would I go if I was an investor?
No, like if I want an investment at my age for like a breakthrough idea, where would I go?
Where do you go?
Yeah.
Look on either side of you. Chances are that someone next to you has a tremendous idea, and if you're in the Silicon Valley of New York.
No, I'm saying like I have the idea.
You have the idea.
Yeah, and I need an investor.
Okay. Let's talk afterwards.
No,
I got you.
I can answer that question.
So you have an idea. You need capital, right?
Yeah.
So the first place that young entrepreneurs go to are angel investors, and typically those first angel investors may be parents, family, friends, relatives, because typically they're more lenient in their terms, and you'll have to, you have to say, well, if you invest in my idea, maybe I'll give you a piece of my company, or maybe I'll provide interest on the amount that you'll loan me when I'll structure a term for the loan that they may make to you. If you want to move beyond that, then you're going to a bank, or you're going to, if your idea is big enough and interesting enough, you might go to a venture capitalist.
I went to a bank, they looked at me and laughed at me.
Then, did you try the first idea? Friends, relatives?
Oh yeah, my parents, they're like, have no hope in that.
I think I could jump over here.
So there's also the web, right? The internet. So you have GoFundMe kind of ideas?
If it's real or not.
I'm sorry?
I don't know if it's real or not. Like, I could see like a lot of things, and like, how do I know if like they're actually gonna do it or it's just like a scam or something?
Oh no! If you could set up a GoFundMe account, in other words, you set up the account and they send you the money, and they have to worry whether you're scamming them or not.
You could also join the Entrepreneur Club here at St. Francis College, because we offer a free.
Where do I sign up?
As well.
Oh, I see Mary in the back. Ed.
Yeah. So that would be the first step.
Thank you. What are your feelings on Kickstart and crowdfunding to assist the beginning entrepreneurs?
They got a great boost with the Jobs Act a couple of years ago. I know the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ were both involved in helping to get the Jobs Act move forward to try to reignite entrepreneurship in the U.S. and without all of the regulations that come along with starting new companies. So I think that those types of vehicles are terrific. I think they're another venue for funding potential, and they're less traditional, which makes them more interesting, in my opinion.
Hi, my name is Phoebe Lee. I'm actually a double major of accounting IT, so I'm interested in knowing more of like a technology perspective. So you mentioned the New York Stock Exchange switched from manual operation into automation. Can you talk about the challenges you and your colleagues faced when you guys have to go through those implementation periods, and in general, how technology have changed the trading floor?
That's a great question. Thank you. My wife asked me last night, are you sympathetic to Samsung? And I said, I'm totally sympathetic to them. She goes, didn't they test that? And I said, honey, I'm sure they tested the heck out of those phones, but things happen. And when you're moving forward with new technologies and sometimes converting old ways of doing things into a newer technology, you can't anticipate all the things that might happen. You might say, well, they should have anticipated the ion batteries were going to, burn up. But even still, I know that at the New York Stock Exchange, when a buy order came in to buy at the same price that a sell order was priced in the market to sell, that they should probably just trade, and I didn't need a person to stand there and hit a keyboard to do that. So, in kind of human factors way, we would study the human, what they would do, and then try to replicate that with software. And in that case, when the buy order came in and the sell order was willing to sell, we wrote the code to execute that transaction and send the print to the tape so that everybody knows that the transaction happened. Update the quote so that the sell order was no longer in the market, and the buy order was no longer in the market, and then we had to update the bid and the offer, and then send the transaction to the clearing corporation for it to actually go through the process of taking the money out of one person's account and putting the stock in the other person's account. It wasn't always that simple. Things would go wrong, and so we would test it, and then we realized we couldn't possibly write enough test cases to cover the universe of potential things that could go wrong. Then we hired people to write code to write test cases. And then our test cases went from 100 or 200 test cases to multiple thousands of test cases. But even given that, you're only limited by the boundaries of your imagination and the code that you can write. So things went wrong all the time. I was lucky at the time that I had somebody who is a CEO who was an engineer, John Thane, who presided over the exchange during the years that we converted it from a fully manual market to a hybrid market, was an engineering major at MIT. And every week I had to explain to him what code we had written, what code we tested, what code we put in place, what software was cutting over. We cut over hundreds and hundreds of software releases. And he was intimately involved in every one of them. So it's really helpful if you have somebody, a culture at the very top that understands that things can go wrong and is involved in it.
Hi. If you had the opportunity to have dinner with yourself back when you were 21 or 22, what are some things you would share with him about the future?
Wow, that's a great question. When I was 21, 22, I was not the dinner kind of going out guy. I was a little different. I would share with him that to continue to be optimistic and to continue to stay the course, that everything works out, that don't let naysayers get you down, because if you work hard and you keep focused, that you can be successful. And I think that for me, I think that would have been the biggest thing that I could have given myself in terms of advice at the time. It's a great question.
So my question is that if a company wants to go public and it is turned down by the New York Stock Exchange, then it will have to go through the process from over again, or it will just keep modifying and prove that it can go public.
Yeah, they have a couple of choices. You raise an excellent point. So if they're turned down because their market capitalization is not large enough, at the time, or the valuation is large enough, or they haven't made money yet, right? So they can't demonstrate a steady stream of income, and they wait a year or two, and maybe they can now demonstrate that, or maybe they made improvements to their product and the public has recognized it and uses it more, so their company is valued at a higher level. They could come back and reapply to the same exchange, whether it's NYSE or NASDAQ, or they can decide to stay private for a while, or they can decide to go to the it's called the pink sheets, where you're available to for investment. There isn't an active continuous market in your security on a national stock exchange, but you're able to be public in the OTC market or the pink sheets. Or you could go to the competitor. So if you got turned down by the NYSE, you could go try and be listed at the NASDAQ. There might be a quirk in their listing standards that would allow you to list there instead.
Thank you all for great questions. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time.